weekdays.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt and Savannah Guthrie.
Good day, everyone. We're coming on the air for another consequential moment in American history. Right now, former President Donald Trump is making his way to a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C.
He is set to be arraigned this afternoon on 4 charges, accusing him of trying to overturn the 2020 election and defraud the voters of the United States. These are the most serious charges ever faced by a former president.
When he arrives at the courthouse, and we expect that shortly, the former president will surrender to authorities for the 3rd time in 4 months. The courthouse is just 1 block from the Capitol building where Mr. Trump was inaugurated as the 45th president, but also, of course, the site of the infamous riots on January 6th. The charges involve the then president's actions in the weeks leading up to that day and, in fact, on the day itself.
And we're watching, of course, that motorcade as it heads to the federal courthouse in downtown Washington. Let's talk about these charges today. They're all felonies. Conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and finally, conspiracy against rights. Now, what we will see today is just an arraignment, and in fact, we will not see it. It's in federal court. There are no cameras. It will be brief. Mr. Trump will be given a chance to enter his pleas. He is expected, of course, to plead not guilty on all counts.
When the former president arrives, as we said, he'll be processed. He will be fingerprinted. No mugshot, as was the case at the Miami arraignment some weeks ago. This is a federal case, as Savannah points out. We're not going to see any pictures from inside the courtroom. We do have reporters inside the courthouse. There is a media listening room, if you will, and we will get minute-by-minute updates throughout the process.
In this matter today, Mr. Trump is the sole defendant. We expect the hearing to be short. The fallout, that is another story. Huge implications for the 2024 race for president and beyond. So we've got our political and legal teams here with us to help us walk through all of it. We say good afternoon to you, but let us start with Peter Alexander, who is at the courthouse for us this morning. Peter, walk us through what we can expect today.
Savannah and Lester, good afternoon to you. You see the president now en route to this courthouse, not as a former president so much as he is as a criminal defendant, returning here to Washington, D.C., where he will be entering this court building behind us here. To be clear, this has become a familiar scene, but this one is no less extraordinary. Lester, as you pointed out, we are just a matter of blocks away from the seat of American democracy, the United States Capitol, the democracy that the former president is accused of trying to subvert in these 2 felony counts here. We do expect the president will arrive here. We will not see him entering through a back entrance, going underground, where he'll be taken into this courtroom alongside U.S. Marshals and Secret Service that are always in his company. The security, even in Washington, that has become battle-tested, certainly in the wake of January 6th, has been particularly tight here. You have the Secret Service, you have the U.S. Marshals that have signed a police tape behind us that reads "Do not cross." The Capitol Police, as well as the Metropolitan Police, all of whom have said they are prepared for this day, hosting a series of calls in recent days. We have been seeing, among others, a small number of protesters, demonstrators on both sides, perhaps numbering in the dozens right now, but no sincere security issues that we have witnessed at this time. It will be a magistrate judge who will be presiding over today's hearing. We do not know if we will hear from the former president himself with that not guilty plea, as with the indictment that took place in Florida. Only a matter of weeks ago, it was the attorney on his behalf who gave the not guilty plea. This magistrate judge is not the judge who is presiding over this case. That's a federal judge by the name of Moxila Upadhyay, and she is notable for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that she's presided over many of the cases with criminal defendants who were accused of storming the Capitol back on January 6th. More than 1,000 of those cases have come through this courthouse. More than 700 of them have been found guilty, 560 in total, now serving up to 18 years' time. But that judge, Tanya Chutkan, who is the judge who will be presiding over the actual case, she has a history with former President Trump. It was November of 2021 when she was presiding over the case, when the former president was arguing arguing that executive privilege protected him from his White House records being turned over to the House, to the congressional committees that were investigating January 6th. And at that time, though she did not see the former president in person, this was all done through filings, paper filings. She did say, among other things, presidents are not kings, presidents are not kings, and the president, and the plaintiff is not president. So she has had some very tough words and has been known for the tough tone she has taken toward criminal defendants in the past. That is the scene here. We expect to get notes from our teams, not just traveling with the former president right now in that motorcade, but also those inside the courthouse. Savannah and Lester, as we got those, we will share those with you. And within the last few minutes, we have learned that Jack Smith, the special counsel, has departed his office only a short distance away. No indication exactly where he's going, but it is likely that he would be headed to this courtroom on the second floor, courtroom 22, where the proceedings will take place.
All right, Peter, stand by there. We continue to watch that, and we've just learned that President Trump has arrived via the underground garage there at the courthouse in downtown Washington.
Let's bring in our panel now. NBC News senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson, senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett, chief White House correspondent Kristen Welker, and legal analyst Danny Savalos. Good to have you all here. This is, we've noted, of course, the third indictment of this former president, but these charges to many stand alone. Kristen Welker, this is the first time we're seeing a former president accused of trying to stop the democratic process, the lawful election of a president.
And as you said at the top, these are among the most serious charges that he is facing in these three indictments. It's a somber moment for the country, undoubtedly. What does it mean politically speaking? With each indictment, we've seen former President Trump's poll numbers go up, his fundraising go up. In fact, his super PAC has paid out more money in legal bills than it's brought in this past year. But he's just become increasingly emboldened in this Republican primary. Notably speaking, his former Vice President Mike Pence, for the first time, really started to sharpen his tone yesterday to say anyone who has violated the Constitution in this way should not be president. But for the most part, his GOP challengers have really kept the gloves off, have walked a very fine line, have kept their sights trained on the DOJ. And politically speaking, that has allowed him to continue to be emboldened. If you take a step back, historically speaking, going back to Ronald Reagan, in primaries where there's no incumbent, anyone with this type of lead runs away with it, with the example of 2008, when Barack Obama came back against Hillary Clinton. We'll have to see if that happens this time.
You say emboldened. I believe the former president said today, one more indictment and I'll be cruising to election. Let's turn to Laura Jarrett on the legal issues here, because as mentioned by Lester, there are 3 indictments, cases pending in New York State Court. There's another federal case in Miami. This case that we are going to see arraigned today is the heart of the matter. This goes to the very issue of whether or not he tried to obstruct, overthrow the transition, the peaceful transition of power in 2020. What are these charges? Walk them through.
There's 4 different charges, and they primarily relate to all of the steps that the president, the former president, and his allies, even though they're not named in this actual indictment, they're all over it. And it's about a conspiracy, and a conspiracy to stop the peaceful transition of power, to specifically stop what had been done by no other president, to stop the actual electoral college from voting on January 6th. And we think about the iconic images of the mob storming the Capitol that day, and that was one of the ways that many have tried to stop the peaceful transition of power and have been prosecuted for it. But this indictment tells another story, and another way that the peaceful transition of power was thwarted, according to prosecutors, was by actually submitting these false slates of electors. And the idea was to give the former vice president a pretext to say, aha, look, we have dueling slates of electors. I guess, therefore, either we have to kick it back to the states, or in the most radical version, actually, was that the former vice president could unilaterally just declare Trump the rightful winner. That did not happen. Pence did not go along with the plan. And according to prosecutors, that broke the law.
Let me bring in Hallie Jackson now to talk about the 2 lanes at work here. There is a political lane. What we're seeing today is a legal lane, a legal process, the arraignment of a suspect. But in terms of the political messaging, from this point on to trial, which could be a considerable amount of months, it seems like Donald Trump kind of owns the microphone, owns the platform.
He does. That's how he wants it. That's how he likes it. And that's what we're continuing to see, as he is even today on his Truth Social platform telling his supporters that he's essentially having this happen for them. He's putting it back attack on his loyalists here. You talk about the legal and the political lanes. It's kind of all one big lane, because that's what Donald Trump wants to see out of this. There's something interesting that happened today. Former Vice President Mike Pence, who, as Laura and Kristen have noted, was central to this indictment, not for any sort of reasons of wrongdoing, but because he is the one who rejected this scheme. The indictment lays out how the former president, this indictment says, turned to Mike Pence after Mr. Pence told him, "I will not go along with this," and said, "You're too honest." The former vice president today, also a presidential candidate, by the way, is selling merch. He's got hats that say "Too Honest" on them. He is actually fundraising now off of this very clear distinction and divide between him and Donald Trump on this issue of election security. You talk about the other rivals in the campaign. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has gone so far as to float legal strategies for the former president, suggesting maybe they should change venue. Look at the difference between D.C. and other places. D.C. is a blue city. Should be noted as we're looking at some of these live images. I know we just saw the former president get off his plane. He waved. He's coming in. We, at least to what I'm looking at now, this looks a little different than when we were down in Miami for the first federal arraignment of former President Trump. Part of that is the political context here. Washington voted something like 92% for Joe Biden. That is not the case, and it was not the case in South Florida for Donald Trump.
Well, it's interesting when we talk about the legal and political lanes, because in point of fact, they're being massively conflated right now. And I want to turn to Danny Savalas, another of our legal analysts, on this issue, because one of the political arguments being made is dressed up as a legal argument. And we're hearing the former president's lawyers all over the airwaves saying this indictment, it criminalizes the First Amendment. If you can't speak, where is this country going? Can you take that issue on? I mean, is that what we're talking about here? The weaponization of the Justice Department. This is what many, many people feel and believe about these indictments.
Yeah, the First Amendment has never been absolute immunity to say anything you want. There have always been exceptions to the First Amendment. For example, threats. For example, if somebody picks up the phone and calls the Secretary of State of Georgia and implies that he's engaged in federal crimes if he doesn't comply with what the person on the phone is asking him to do, especially if that person is the head of the executive branch, which is the head of the DOJ. That's an example of speech that's pretty much unrelated to conduct. It is just speech, and that alone can be criminalized. But the core of this case is also going to, all roads will lead back to Trump's intent. What did he intend? And a corollary to that is, what did he know? And I've been hearing a lot over the past 24 hours about, well, you can't prove absolutely what somebody thought, knew, intended. Yes, prosecutors have dealt with that since the first crimes were ever committed. And they have a workaround for that. They simply march in enough witnesses and circumstantial evidence so that a jury can infer what somebody actually thought. And in a sense, Jack Smith is setting a bit of a trap here for Donald Trump, in that if he wants to tell the jury what he actually thought, he may not have the burden to prove anything, but there is one way for him to go up there and prove that. He's going to have to take the stand. Same too with any advice of counsel defense. He's going to have to get up there and take the stand and say, look, I believed what I believed because of what these people were telling me. But make no mistake about it, the defense here is going to put the election back on trial. They almost have to. That's how they're going to create reasonable doubt. And then they'll argue to a jury in summation, look, it may not have ended up being right. Maybe it even sounded wacky, but Donald Trump was surrounded by people who told him that the election was being stolen, and that's why he acted. And it doesn't have to be a perfect defense. It just has to create reasonable doubt.
I want to talk a little bit about the jury, the fact that it's a Washington jury, a blue state jury. We've talked about the red state jury in Florida on the other charges. There seems to be this assumption that jury nullification is a risk. Is it as big a deal as we tend to think of it as? How common is it?
Well, jury nullification, in a way, exists in the ether. We don't have rules about it. What jury nullification is the idea that a jury goes into the jury room, in theory, because most jury deliberations, we never really find out what happened. Even if we poll the jurors afterwards or interview them, I mean, we have to take their word for it because it's not transcribed. We don't know what went on in that jury room. But the idea behind jury nullification is when a jury goes in and they decide, well, look, all the elements are there. It's all been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, but we simply are not going to convict. The rules are very clear. We as lawyers can never talk about jury nullification in argument. We can't suggest to the jury that they have this power that they've always had. It would make sense. I can't simply go up there and argue on behalf of a defendant, hey, the government has proven each and every element. If you find that, still, if you like this guy, you can acquit him. I can never, ever, ever say that in closing. But every jury does have that power. They're just never told that they have that power. So when it comes to statistics and how to deal with it, it's a problem that exists, but it's a problem that may never be able to be addressed through rulemaking.
Let's take a step back here, because we're of course waiting for the arraignment of Donald Trump in the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. He'll be arraigned this afternoon on 4 charges related to his alleged efforts to overthrow the 2020 election. But let's talk about the venue. Let's talk about Washington, D.C., Laura. We know there was a federal case in Miami. It was charged in and filed in Miami. A judge was selected. That was a Trump-appointed judge, Aileen Cannon. Now we have in Washington, D.C., they filed it there. That is where the venue is. And there's another judge, a judge who was appointed by Obama. First of all, let's just point out, the judge you get is completely selected at random. In both cases.
Yes.
It's the luck of the draw. And as far as venue is concerned, because we've already heard President Trump say maybe they should move this Washington case to West Virginia, where I think he won by 40-plus points.
Yeah.
Talk about how emotional like that might be received by a judge, either in Washington or in Miami, for that matter.
Not well. So prosecutors, first of all, right, basic principles, you have to choose the venue based on where the seat of the crime occurred. So that's why they brought the case in Florida, because according to prosecutors, that's where the obstruction took place, moving the boxes, all of that. We know that. And obviously, they would prefer to have a judge like Judge Aileen Cannon versus Judge Chutkan, who's going to be in D.C. hearing the case. But as you said, it's on a wheel. They have no choice in the matter. However, Judge Chutkan has been very hard, very tough on January 6 cases. And so that's why I said I do not think she's going to receive a motion for transfer of venue well. She knows the facts of this case. She knows that unless he actually has a good argument for why you cannot get a fair trial in the District of Columbia, that motion should be dismissed. And you don't get a win on that kind of motion just by looking at polling, just by looking at the fact that the majority of voters there happen to vote for Donald Trump. You actually have to prove that you fundamentally cannot get a fair trial. Now, the trauma that Washington, D.C. went through, given the attack on the Capitol, that actually might be an interesting argument to make. But it can't be purely based off of just the voting stats in that state.
Which trial is going to go first?
Well, that'll be largely up to Judge Chutkan. And if I'm Jack Smith, I'm going to say, look, Judge, this isn't about classified documents. This is very simple. And you've already heard him make the argument. He wants a speedy trial. And as we've all talked about, of course, the right to a speedy trial is there to protect the defendant. It's an important right. It's a constitutional principle. But there is another thing on the other side of the ledger, which is the right of the public to have this crime, this alleged crime, adjudicated fairly. And I think that's an argument you're going to start to hear from the prosecutors.
It's fascinating because in his very spare news conference the other day when Jack Smith addressed the cameras, he did say we're ready for a speedy trial. There is a law, a speedy trial, it's a term of art. It's 70 days. He's saying I can bring this case to court in 70 days. However, it is the defendant's right under the 6th Amendment, and so they can ask for a continuance, but not in perpetuity, not forever. Let's go to Peter Alexander. He's outside the courthouse as we await this arraignment. So what are the procedures, Peter? I mean, we see different things in Miami versus the state counts in New York. How will this go down once the president is inside and is placed under arrest and arraigned on these charges?
Yeah, Savannah, a lot of it repeats itself. The processing happens in each separate jurisdiction each time. So the president, likely with U.S. Marshals and Secret Service, will be taken to a booking area here where we are told that he will be providing his fingerprints digitally, no ink like back in the old days. There's no expectation that a mugshot will be taking of this president. Though you remember after the indictment that took place in New York, the Trump campaign posted a pretend mugshot and put it on T-shirts to try to raise money off what's taking place here. So it's likely that the president will have that booking process. Will also be asked for some details in the sort of question and answer session with some of the authorities inside, where he will provide details that include likely his age as that takes place. This whole process, he could be in the courtroom for only a matter of, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 minutes, but he's likely to be in the courthouse for a bit longer. In Florida, the entire proceeding was short, but the entire visit to to the courthouse there lasted just shy of 2 hours. Again, to be clear, at this time, we have no expectation that President Trump himself will be the one that provides the not guilty plea today, as took place after he was indicted in Florida. It was his attorney who spoke on his behalf. But what's sort of striking here, Lester and Savannah, is just how small this courtroom is. This is a very small courtroom. It will have as many or as few as 5 seats for members of the public, as few as 11 seats for journalists who will be pooling their information. There is an overflow room where other journalists from organizations not just around the country but around the world can witness what happens inside. There is a larger courtroom inside this building. That's not being used for technological reasons because they can't get the audio and video out, but there are certainly no cameras that will be in there shooting any video or photos that can be shared or disseminated widely. All of this will effectively happen in the dark, minus the information that's provided by those witnesses in the room. Among those likely to be there, Jack Smith, the special counsel who we knew headed this direction only a short time ago.
Yeah, Peter, and as you talk, I'm reminded that in Miami, the judge imposed some conditions that the prosecutors didn't ask for in terms of who the former president could contact and talk about the case. Is that something we might expect, Laura, here?
Yeah, and it was interesting because that just came up all on the judge's own whim. And they really wanted to make sure that the former president wasn't talking to any witnesses. And the idea is that you don't want to be having, an accusation that they're trying to get their story straight.
Well, here you have 6 unindicted.
Correct. And that adds a level of complication. These are people who, obviously, we've put together the pieces for who they are, but they are not accused of any crime here. But theoretically, the judge, on her own, could say, I order you not to talk to any of the witnesses that might have material information in this case. And
just to be clear, this is a magistrate judge who will handle this arraignment today.
She will be the trial judge.
Right, Judge Chutkan will ultimately be the trial judge. But then, do you think the magistrate judge could put conditions like that today at the arraignment? Okay.
Easily. We have to watch for that, yeah.
Let's bring in former U.S. Attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. He's also an NBC News legal analyst. You've heard us chatting about the jury and Washington, D.C. What should we know about this venue and how it may or may not affect what happens going forward?
Well, Lester, I believe that a defendant can get a fair trial anywhere if the judge and lawyers on both sides take the time to do it right. So let me explain what right looks like. And by the way, Savannah will remember this from the 9/11 trial that took place in the Eastern District of Virginia when I was U.S. Attorney. In that case, Judge Brinkema, and remember, the courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, the federal courthouse, is just 3 miles from the Pentagon, site of where one of the hijacked planes was crashed. And the question, of course, was could you get a fair trial in that venue, given the trauma, given the connections to the Pentagon, given the number of victims who were from the area. And what Judge Brinkema did, federal judge Leone Brinkema did, was send out hundreds and hundreds of questionnaires to a very large pool of potential jurors. And then lawyers on both sides, with the court involved in the process, went through those questionnaires to screen out anyone who said they couldn't be fair. In either direction, Lester. From that large pool of people who responded to the questionnaires, the judge brought many, many, many more potential jurors into the courtroom so she could directly question them and ascertain whether or not they could be fair, meaning they weren't looking for people who had never heard of the attacks of 9/11. That would be a little bit frightening. They were looking for people who could put aside what they knew, what they believed, what they supposed, and who would promise under oath to listen to the evidence adduced in court, to follow the instructions of the judge, and to apply the law. So, if you're concerned about the notoriety of the case or the notoriety of the defendant or the proximity of where the case is being tried to where the trauma occurred, there are procedures that judges can use with both parties participating to cull jurors from a very large pool. Because in the end, you just need 12 jurors and perhaps 4 alternates, 16 people who say they can be fair. Can you get a fair trial in the District of Columbia? Absolutely. A motion to change venue will be made, and it will be denied.
It's a good reminder, Chuck Rosenberg, you were there, you were the U.S. attorney in that courthouse, and it just underscores the point. This is not the first high-profile case that's ever been tried. This is not the first high-profile defendant. The jury that is sought is not a group of people who have never heard of the person, never heard of the case or the facts of the case. It's for people who say that they can be impartial, and that jury will be selected in all of these cases after a lengthy voir dire or a questioning process. Let's turn to NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd. And Chuck, one of the issues here, there's a legal calendar we could talk about. There is a political calendar. And the election, whatever it is, 14, 15 months away. I know you know the dates by heart and the days. You probably have a little countdown on your calendar there. But they're going to run right into each other. And it's quite relevant as to how this might turn out.
Look, it is, and that's the thing, and what's interesting is, you know, those that are paying the closest attention to this are not necessarily, you know all of this, but I think there's a lot of voters out there that aren't fully paying attention, and when the actual trials start sometime in the spring of 24, which is, if any of them start that early, I'm a cynic. I assume somehow lawyers always find a way to delay, but let's assume they all. Then there is going to be this sort of a primary one day, a court appearance another, and a primary another day. Maybe he's wrapping up the nomination, and then there's a court appearance. Maybe it's for a motion, maybe it's for something else. And then that's when I think it's going to have a political impact. And I think a lot of elected Republicans then are going to have that panic attack, going, oh my God, what has the party done? And it'll be too late. And I think that what's interesting here is when you think about it, before the Iowa caucuses, it's unlikely there's really going to be any more new information that might have an impact on voters that comes out. But say come May, June, or July, you know, maybe you see Mark Meadows testify against the former president, right? And all of that could have an impact. But the political calendar, it may be too late to change things. Hey, I want to throw two topics for your group to discuss. Number one, Savannah. I think this is the trial of the century, most important trial perhaps in American history. Are we really not going to have an live audio? All right, I can understand live television. We're not going to have live audio. The Supreme Court has made exceptions when the cases are of a high importance to the public, and considering the world of misinformation, I think everybody would want to see this in real time. And then the second thing is we shouldn't even be here. This should have been done with the impeachment trial, but Mitch McConnell decided that this was the better place. The founders knew what the right venue was. Mitch McConnell decided otherwise, and here we are.
Okay, Chuck, assignment accepted. What should we do first? I think maybe we should clarify the second question. I think what Chuck is saying, yes, okay, good. I think what Chuck is introducing for all of us to consider is that the founders and the Constitution contemplated impeachment as the remedy for a president who did wrong, not a criminal trial. There was an impeachment proceeding. Chuck is saying that Mitch McConnell and the Republicans did not convict in the Senate when they had the chance. Hence, now we're left to the this other branch, the judiciary. And do our political team here want to weigh in on that?
I'll make a point and toss it to Kristen here, which is that, and at that time, Savannah, just to remind people of the context, you heard Republican senators say, actually, the proper venue is not in Congress, it is in a court of law. Well, look where we are now. Look what's happening at this point, right? Just to show how that needle, that thread gets sort of pulled through the needle here.
Absolutely. And Mitch McConnell said that, by the way, as well. I've been talking to top Republicans who have expressed frustration with the timeline of all of this. They make that same point. If we had dealt with this at the time, we wouldn't be here now, because they want to hold on to the House. They want to win back the Senate. And yet, what are they doing? They're having to answer questions about former President Trump and about January 6th, not what they want to be talking about. And they wish that the legal proceedings had gone more quickly. And based on your interview with Trump's attorney on the Today Show, it seems like the strategy there is to potentially run out the clock, Savannah, because there is a scenario where he could be potentially convicted and also elected president.
We also have to remember the Republican Party is not a monolith, right? There are serious factions inside the GOP as to who they want to see be the leader, who voters want to see be the leader.
It's Trump
I'm
is
talking
by
about in
far
Washington.
away.
I'm
Okay,
talking
in
about
Washington.
in DC, inside the Beltway, right?
Because voters are overwhelmingly supporting Trump.
75% of the Republican base thinks that the GOP should back Donald Trump. no matter what, in these legal issues, right? There is 7 in 10 think that he has done nothing criminally serious. I'm talking about the leaders that we're referencing here, the folks in the Senate, the folks in the House. But look at what the conservative allies of the former president are doing in the House of Representatives. They're going after the former president's political opponent, Joe Biden, and his son Hunter, and you are seeing that today cranked to an 11. We just saw, we didn't show it here, but a legal spokesperson for the former president's team addressed reporters, largely talking not about Donald Trump, but about what they see as wrongdoing by President Biden's son. You're seeing a handout given to reporters traveling with the president, the former president, in that so-called pool, talking about quote-unquote criminals, not referring to the former president, but referring to the Bidens. This is something that has been a political strategy for the former president, and we are seeing that in a big, big way here today.
When we were talking a moment ago about the political calendar and the court calendar, if the judge starts making allowances because there is a presidential election, does that not become a slippery slope?
Yes. And that's what I think the argument that you're going to hear from her is that I can't just make exceptions because he happens to be the Republican frontrunner. On the other hand, there are other criminal trials, and that's something she will take into account. And the fact that he has a criminal trial date for May of next year in the classified documents case, if they say, Judge, look, we're facing this other trial, that's a legitimate argument that she may actually.
Well, there are many, many reasons. We talked about this notion of a speedy trial. You talked about the interview we did with John Laura, one of the defense attorneys who will appear today. And I was saying, the feds want to take him to trial in 70 days. He said, how are we supposed to be ready in 70 days? Fair enough. How are they supposed to be ready? The issue with this is you as a defendant can go in and say, I waive my right to a speedy trial. I need more time. I need more time for discovery. I want to file this motion. Oh, I lost my motion. I want to go up on appeal. All of this can get stretched out. And it's up to the judge to determine whether or not the request for delay is legitimate, substantive, and correct. Here's the thing. The question is where it runs into politics. If these trials last past the election and Trump is reelected, is it for all intents and purposes these cases are over?
Oh, 100%.
And is that part of the strategy, run out the clock?
100%. But we should remind our viewers, the state cases do not go away. So obviously the case that we're talking about today is a federal case. The classified documents case is a federal case. The first case that we brought us all here, the hush money case out of New York having to do with allegedly falsifying business records, that does not go away. That's set for March of next year. And we're all obviously waiting what's going to go happen in Georgia as it relates to election interference. That would not go away. So he has no ability to affect those.
True. He couldn't pardon or to dismiss the cases. However, let's be clear that under the Constitution, you can be a convicted felon and run for president. There would be no bar to him running and being elected for president.
Let me bring Chuck Rosenberger to this conversation. Chuck, there's a lot of ifs and what ifs, but they're real.
They're real, Lester. So I could imagine two ways that these cases could disappear. The federal ones could disappear if Mr. Trump is reelected. First, because as president, he would be the head of the executive branch. So with or without the consent of his attorney general, he could order the dismissal of any pending federal cases. Second, as president, he could pardon anybody for any federal crime, which means all of the unindicted co-conspirators, for instance, in the newest indictment could be pardoned, or all of his co-defendants in the Florida case could be pardoned. There is an open question because the Constitution is not clear on this point as to whether or not a president can pardon himself. The only exception articulated in the Constitution, Lester, is that a president can pardon except in cases of impeachment. So had he been impeached and removed, in other words, convicted in the Senate, and he was not, he couldn't.
However, let's be clear that under the Constitution, you can be a convicted felon and run for president. There would be no bar to him running and being elected for president.
Let me bring Chuck Rosenberger to this conversation. Chuck, there's a lot of ifs and what ifs, but they're real.
They're real, Lester. So I could imagine two ways that these cases could disappear. The federal ones could disappear if Mr. Trump is reelected. First, because as president, he would be the head of the executive branch. So with or without the consent of his attorney general, he could order the dismissal of any pending federal cases. Second, as president, he could pardon anybody for any federal crime, which means all of the unindicted co-conspirators, for instance, in the newest indictment could be pardoned, or all of his co-defendants in the Florida case could be pardoned. There is an open question because the Constitution is not clear on this point. It's whether or not a president can pardon himself. The only exception articulated in the Constitution, Lester, is that a president can pardon except in cases of impeachment. So had he been impeached and removed, in other words, convicted in the Senate, and he was not, he couldn't pardon that. However, the question of whether or not a president can pardon his own federal criminal conduct has never been litigated. There are principles strewn throughout our law that suggest that no person can be a judge in his or her own case. We know that no person is above the law, but breathing life into those tenets are difficult and untried and untested. And so, yes, he could certainly pardon anybody as president other than himself. He might also be able to pardon himself, but we would have to litigate that. And if any federal cases are pending, he could have those dismissed as the head of the executive branch. Somebody on the panel just a moment ago wisely raised the point that a president could not pardon any state criminal conduct. Let me just add one more note to that. In Georgia, the governor of Georgia does not have the pardon power. Georgia is one of about half a dozen states where that power by statute has been delegated to a commission or to a committee. So for Georgia, it would have to be done by a parole and pardon commission. In New York, it could only be the governor of New York. On the federal level, of course, it would be a president.
All right.
Thank you very much. I just want to say we're watching this scene unfold outside the courthouse in Washington, D.C. as we await moments from now, about 15 minutes from now, if they follow the schedule, the arraignment of Donald Trump on these 4 charges. It's so interesting. It's great. We have the legal side over here and the political side over here. It's like a tennis match. We can just watch it unfold.
And on screen, too, in the shot of the Capitol.
But incredibly serious. And it's so interesting because I was just noting that Jason Miller, who's the top advisor to President Trump, is with him right now. Right. He's tweeting, making commentary about coming to Washington. He's also, not by name, but he's in this indictment. And we see this time and time again. People that are still in the president's orbit, very much in the president's orbit, are all over these cases as potential witnesses, if not more.
Well, absolutely.
Go ahead, Kristen.
Well, I was going to say, you're absolutely right. Jason Miller among those still in his inner circle, and yet it's gotten smaller and smaller. One of the fascinating things about the indictment is it lays out how many voices were in his ear. Rudy Giuliani, for example, another co-conspirator.
Actually, Jason Miller has one of the more colorful quotes, which I cannot read exactly.
Don't say it, Savannah.
I won't, but what he's saying is it's all just conspiracy doo-doo beamed down from the mothership, Jason Miller wrote. And that quote, which goes to this issue of intent. Did he really believe that the election was stolen? Jason Miller, that's his quote in the indictment, and here he is on the way to the courthouse.
You talk about the Donald Trump circle. We should talk about the unindicted co-conspirators who are in this indictment, people who we've identified, which we haven't gotten into, that relates to this issue of a potential speedy trial, right? The fact that the special counsel's office did not bring charges against these people. Danny, I'm sure you'd want to weigh in here, but legal experts have said to me that's potentially because they want to get this thing going. They don't want to get bogged down with 5 other defense attorneys and issues. Well, or they want to talk to them. Rudy Giuliani, you have people like, of course, the former president's former attorney. You have people like Sidney Powell, a conspiracy theorist who is part of the sort of Trump campaign apparatus there. Kenneth Chesebro, a top Department of Justice official. Jeffrey Clark as well. I mean, these are all people who were part of this alleged plot to steal the election, named not by name, but still people that Donald Trump talks to in large part today.
Everything about this indictment is designed for speed. That's why you have unindicted co-conspirators, so you don't have any of the muddling of the docket with numerous motions to dismiss, motions for severance, all manner of motions that would ordinarily clog up the docket and cause delay. Jack Smith, a man of few words, in his statement yesterday, still revealed himself when he said, "We will seek a speedy trial." We can see that from the caption in that there is one defendant named, and yet the government believes there were no less than 6 co-conspirators. That means they believe they were criminally liable, but they are choosing not to indict them.
That's one aspect. It does tighten up the case considerably and speed it up. Also, Laura, in practice, a lot of times prosecutors will put unindicted co-conspirators, and it's a way they're putting the squeeze to these people, hoping to flip them and say, come in and testify against the defendant here, or soon it'll be you facing an indictment.
Absolutely. This is part of the pressure campaign, and we've already seen at least some of them go in for what's known as proffer sessions, where someone actually has to say what they know, and as long as they don't lie to the authorities, the prosecutors can't use what that person says. And the whole idea is that it's part of sort of a negotiation so that you don't get charged, and the government gets something out of it too. We don't know whether any of these people will be eventually charged, but we should also point out, this is not everything that the special counsel office has. This indictment tells part of the story, but they're not required to put in all of the evidence.
I was going to ask you, we saw superseding in the previous case, likely in this case?
Perhaps, although again, you run into issues about how quickly they want to move. But you can already look at this and say, there's a whole bunch of evidence that the January 6th committee brought up that's not even in here. And you wonder what else prosecutors have that they just haven't actually alleged in this indictment and plan to use later.
And Lester and Savannah, one of the things that is in the indictment is the list of people who said to former President Trump, this election was not stolen. And that is one of the key arguments, I think, that is worth noting, including the former vice president, including officials at the Department of Justice who said, look, there was no fraud. And so that, I think, is part of the crux and the thrust of this case that the government's laying out against the
Let me go
president.
to Peter Alexander. He's outside the courthouse. And Peter, I know you have some color from inside the courthouse that reminds us that while these indictments are not specifically on the events of January 6th, they certainly all link.
Yeah, Lester, you're exactly right. Those events of January 6th still haunt this community and haunt this country right now. And among those individuals who have now learned are inside the courthouse, not in the courtroom, but in one of the overflow rooms where they will be witnessing today's events, are at least 3 of the officers who were there on January 6th itself. 2 of them, Capitol Police officers, including Harry Dunn, a face that was familiar to many, and another, a D.C., a Metropolitan Police officer, a man by the name of Daniel Hodges. You'll remember this photo, this video, where he was screaming out in pain as he was crushed between a stolen police shield and the door frame of the Capitol on that day. He testified in this very courthouse in August of last year against 3 of the criminal defendants who were accused of storming the Capitol, being a part of that riot on that day. He described them as being part of what was the cult-like control that Donald Trump had of his supporters. So those are just some of the folks that will be inside the courthouse on this day. I got to tell you, standing outside the court building right now, it is sort of a striking scene. There are none of those massive protests that some had feared would happen. There was certainly a ton of security, but here in Washington, D.C., one of the most popular tourist destinations in the country, where you visit the White House and the Capitol, the National Archives, and all the monuments, this courthouse has itself become a tourist attraction this day, with tons of visitors, not just from here, but from around the world coming to get a glimpse. They won't see the former president, but they will see the circus that surrounds each of these indictments, this now the 3rd that he is facing.
All right, Peter, thank you. Can we talk about Mike Pence? He seems to, reading through this indictment, he seems to be, that interaction seems to be the heart of the government.
Well, he's at the center of the object of the conspiracy, according to the indictment. He was the one they were asking to violate the law, according to prosecutors. And I was so struck by his words yesterday.
He's not biting his tongue anymore.
No, he is not. He really, he unleashed the hounds in terms of his words against Donald Trump. I mean, it is not like Mike Pence to refer to anyone, let alone the former president's lawyers. He said, what did he say? They're a bunch of chuckleheads or crackpots. Never heard him speak like that.
Who said what Donald Trump wanted to hear in his itching ears? I mean, that is not Pencean.
Something has changed. What is it? Is it that, because frankly, he's not registering in the polls very much. So does he feel like, hey, maybe this is the time to take the gloves off?
He's also not, he's leaning into it because he's being asked to it. The question is, there have been signals from his team that they're going to try to make the campaign writ large about other issues, but it's the integrity question. I mean, Mike Pence's team, people around him have been been telling all of us, I think, for months, that they feel like he is, for lack of a better phrase, and these are my words, kind of the adult in the room, right? In this Republican primary, coming in and being the sort of person they think of integrity, person of honor. Well, boy, when Donald Trump is laid out in this indictment as telling Mike Pence, you're too honest, that validates exactly the argument that they're trying to make. Keep in mind how much of the information laid out in this indictment is revealed, according to the prosecution. Contemporaneous notes that Mike Pence took.
Interrupt very briefly, just let you know, the former president, we're told, is now inside the courtroom waiting for his counsel. So it looks like they're running fairly close to on time. 4 o'clock is the scheduled time for this arraignment.
And he's apparently just feet away, too, from special counsel Jack Smith, who is also inside the building.
And they're not in one of those big ceremonial courtrooms. I've been in those courtrooms many times. I'm sure you all have as well. They're pretty darn small, so it's tight quarters in there, as the kids would say, #awkward. Laura, let's talk about Mike Pence, because he came in, he talked to the grand jury. He did not talk to the January 6th committee. Clearly, he's saving his powder for, well, perhaps subpoena and this criminal case, but he's a key witness on not only the events, but also the state of mind of the president. I mean, what Hallie said, they're selling hats on that says, you're too honest, goes directly to whether or not President Trump knew he was lying about these election fraud claims. And that line, you're too honest, to Mike Pence is evidence that, yes, he knew darn well it wasn't true.
And they need sort of that circumstantial evidence, because they don't have the president's own words by himself. He obviously didn't come in to talk to them. All they have are these witnesses who are essential. And in so many of these instances, the president sort of laying it bare, I think, in the you're too honest, and also the one about just tell that, just say it's corrupt and we'll take care of the rest of it, right? That's what he said to the acting deputy attorney general about this whole scheme. It just, again, it speaks to the idea, as prosecutors are going to say, that he knew what he was doing was wrong, and that it was a consciousness of wrongdoing. Now, I think you're going to hear, this is, again, the first step among many. The arraignment is just like really the baby steps, but along the way, I think you're going to hear prosecutors say, we don't actually have to show that he knew that he lost. All we have to show is that he actually had a corrupt intent, a corrupt mindset. And they lay out their evidence for that. But they are going to say that we don't actually have to show that he knew he lost.
And just to put Mike Pence into context, this is someone who is deeply religious. Before he actually announced he was running for president, we were told he was praying about this with his family. He is also now a presidential candidate who, as you say, is barely registering in the polls, has not qualified for the first debate yet. And the question for each of these candidates is, how do they stand out? How do they get in this game? Part of this is Mike Pence trying to get into the game so that he can make that debate stage in just a few weeks now.
Well, it's just so interesting because you have an array of candidates who will take the gloves off. Chris Christie is probably the leader of that, but you see Asa Hutchinson. And then you have these other candidates who are trying to walk the line. You've got your DeSantis, and they're getting on the weaponization train. And what about Hunter train? It's not really helping any of them. So pick your lane. It's not helping because Donald Trump has 54% of the vote right now in the primary.
This goes back to part of what we learned in 2016, which is that Donald Trump has a base that is immovable. And if you look at the polls, the gettable votes are the voters in the middle. And what's striking is that you have very few candidates really trying to go after them. I talked to a top Republican who said what needs to happen is that some of these candidates need to start dropping out, or they need to sharpen their tone.
The other piece of it, too, there's a new poll out today showing that 45% of Republicans would not vote for Donald Trump if he was convicted of a felony. That means roughly 55% presumably would, right? I mean, and that speaks to your point, Savannah, and the point that you're making, Kristen. Sure, Mike Pence and Chris Christie and these other candidates can try these different lanes, but the Republican primary electorate likes Donald Trump. The question is, just to remind people, you can't get to the White House if you don't win in a general election, right? So the question really is the political middle. How harmful is this to Donald Trump? Let's say if he does get the nomination come March, April, May.
Will there be a fatigue?
Yeah, the fatigue factor on these indictment things. The other piece of it is, could it just become, and this is a concern that has been relayed to folks on our team, that the indictment noise becomes just that noise. We're now on indictment number 3. There may be indictment number 4 coming in just a matter of weeks here. At what point does the sort of broader general audience start to tune that out?
Let me bring in former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney Catherine Christian. She's also an NBC News legal analyst. Catherine, thank you for joining us. I know you had some thoughts about the importance of Mike Pence in this indictment. There's great descriptions there of things that he was being asked of by the former president, but they don't link that to necessarily a specific charge. How do you think they finessed this or handled this or made this a part of their indictment?
I think it is actually part of a specific charge, the obstruction of the congressional proceedings to certify the election. And I think Mike Pence's anger yesterday was because, quite frankly, when you read the detailed narrative in the indictment of the pressure that the President of the United States put on his Vice President, you also see, quite frankly, that the President of the United States endangered the safety of his Vice President. And it began on Christmas Day of 2020. Mike Pence called Donald Trump just to wish him a Merry Christmas, and then immediately the president turned the conversation around and started asking him to help overturn the election. We've heard about the "you're too honest." That happened on New Year's Day. On New Year's Day, Donald Trump, after Mike Pence said to him, "I don't have the constitutional authority to overturn the election," Donald Trump told him, "You're too honest." On January 5th, Mike Pence was told by the president, "I'm going to have to now publicly single you out." That so concerned Mike Pence's chief of staff that Mike Pence's chief of staff alerted the Secret Service. And then later on that day, Mr. Trump said, and this was January 5th, that the next day, the people who are going to be there are going to be angry. So Donald Trump knew that the people who were showing up the next day on January 6th were going to be angry. And on January 6th, we know that President Trump did, to the crowd, single out Mike Pence. And then in the afternoon, after people have been saying, "Hang Mike Pence," after the violence has occurred, Donald Trump tweeted, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what he should have done to protect our country. 1 minute after that tweet, the Secret Service grabbed the vice president and took him to a secure location. So I think that detailed narrative about the pressure and then, quite frankly, the putting his vice president in danger sort of speaks to what that charge is about, obstructing the congressional proceeding.
If one is inclined to read this indictment, that particular series of quotes and passages are quite interesting.
And our former assistant district attorney from Manhattan lays it out and makes clear that if this comes to trial, Mike Pence is the star witness against Donald Trump, which is quite a remarkable thing to contemplate.
It is the top of the hour now, 4 p.m. in Washington, D.C., where, for those of you just joining us, former President Trump's third arraignment is set to start any moment now.
He has already entered the courtroom in that federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. He has already surrendered to authorities, presumably, and been processed and fingerprinted. No mugshot was to be taken. Obviously, the thinking there, he is well recognizable, and the mugshot is unnecessary.
And Mr. Trump expected to plead not guilty on all counts. A reminder, this arraignment will be brief. We will not see him on camera since cameras are not allowed in federal courts.
We have reporters inside the courthouse, however, who are going to give us updates over email, be able to let us know how the proceeding is going. We've got Peter Alexander stationed outside the courthouse and keeping track of all of it as well. We see a little bit of a hubbub out there, some protests. We certainly see a lot of interest, and we know there are a lot of folks like you out there, Peter, a lot of media interest. Give us the lay of the land.
Yeah, remarkably, we are between the White House and the Capitol. This is the inauguration route where any president would come on their inauguration day, where the former president now stands as a criminal defendant. We are getting some information from inside the second floor, what is courtroom number 22 here. And just to give you a sense of how it works in this small courtroom, facing the judge, the government's table is on the right side. The defendant's table is on the left. Right now, we're told by those who are inside the courthouse that President Trump is in the courtroom right now. He has been discussing the situation, talking with one of his attorneys. Another one of his attorneys was seen visiting with one of the prosecutors at the other table before the former president signed a piece of paper. In the first row, right behind the government's table, is the special counsel himself, Jack Smith. It's not the first time that he has come face-to-face with former President Trump. He was also there for the arraignment that took place in South Florida only a matter of weeks ago, and our reporters who were there at the time said that Smith, throughout much of that brief arraignment, was staring at the former president, in fact, sort of sizing him up, though they say the former president appeared not to look back at any point in the course of the time that they were together. So that's a little bit of a better understanding of what's happening inside the courtroom. Again, the magistrate judge has not yet in this courtroom, expected to arrive there shortly for what, again, is expected to be a short arraignment hearing.
All right, Peter, thanks. We saw some of the sketches. They are allowed in the courtroom, but no cameras allowed to cover this from a visual standpoint.
That was the other question that Chuck wanted us to discuss, whether or not if this comes to trial, there should be at least live audio.
Is it on the table?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I think the judge would have some discretion there under these extraordinary circumstances, but by and large in federal court, it's an absolute no-no. In fact, I've covered cases where you have to leave your well, it used to be a BlackBerry back in the day. It's been a couple, now I'm dating myself. I had a BlackBerry, you had to leave it, you know, literally outside the courthouse. You could not even bring it in. But you wonder, Laura or Danny, I mean, you do a lot of federal court practice, whether or not this would be an occasion where perhaps the public interest would prevail in some kind of live recording and broadcast.
I think you'll get live streamed audio. Think about even the travel ban cases. Those were live streamed in federal court. I think given the circumstances, we will get audio. We will not get video. What is your vote?
Interestingly enough, several years back, the courts conducted a pilot program using video cameras in civil cases only, not criminal cases. And at the conclusion of that pilot program, there are, I believe, 2 districts that still allow video in civil proceedings only. So to say there's a precedent, sort of there is, not for criminal, but it means that the federal courts are seeing a crack in the armor, that they're considering possibly using video going forward. And with the advent of audio recording being widely available, for example, for the Supreme Court oral arguments, the advance of technology, the availability of video, and just generally the idea that we're all just more accustomed to it, we're more comfortable with the idea of video in the courtroom. This is not the OJ trial from 20 plus years ago, maybe 30 years now, where it was something novel. This is something that actually has been going on in federal courts, barely, but they have a foothold, and that may mean something that could expand in the future.
And we see it in state and local courts, and folks should know it's not like a throng of cameras rushing in the courtroom. It's usually one pool camera on a.
Well, it's the only person here I think worked for Court TV back in the day. I know exactly. Oh, you did. Danny did too. The BlackBerry Court TV. We're kicking it way back, but there is a way to do it where first of all the judge controls the feed, the judge controls the camera. The cameras are pooled, so there might be 1 or 2 cameras, but all the networks connect to that feed. And as a political matter, I mean, it would be interesting. Would it be watched? Who would watch it? To see something like this unfold live on television, Hallie, I mean, you know, the notion is that if you see the evidence, then at least you'll understand the process.
Remember, though, we have seen live streamed audio and video on television some of the evidence that has been presented in this indictment, and that was last summer when we were all here together for the January 6th congressional hearings that people had an opportunity to watch, that was out there. And so it is not necessarily new info. It is also potentially a spectacle that does exactly what Donald Trump, if he is in fact the nominee for the White House, when this trial happens and if it were to be shown, what he would want to see, because there is in many ways those around him who want to see the attention on him and on this moment so that he can sort of use it. I also just want to note sort of what an extraordinary moment this is. You mentioned how tiny this courtroom is. They are quite literally face to face. I mean, and as close as potentially like you and I are here right now, Donald Trump, the special counsel prosecuting him, in this moment that is making history, not because it is Donald Trump's first federal indictment, it is not, but because this is a former president accused of disrupting the peaceful transfer of power in this country, who is now running for the White House again.
And adding to the drama, in the shadow of the Capitol and the White House, you could walk from this courthouse to the scene of the alleged crimes here, in fact. Let's bring in Tim Hafey. He's the former lead investigator for the House January 6th Select Committee, who, of course, is well familiar with much of the evidence in this case. I'm curious, because you see the indictment. Some of our analysts have said it's rather spare, and that's understandable because the prosecutors don't have to give everything they've got in an indictment at this phase of a criminal case. Do you think there is more there?
Yeah, probably, Savannah. I mean, it's exactly the multi-part plan to disrupt the joint session that the committee set forth last summer and emphasized in our report. The special counsel has the ability to get additional information and clearly has gotten additional information beyond what was available to the select committee. we could not adjudicate privilege assertions, however meritless or not meritless. He can go right upstairs to the chief judge, who will rule immediately as to whether or not an executive privilege or an attorney-client privilege is or isn't valid, and then the witness is compelled to abide by that ruling. He has used that effectively to get at least Mike Pence, Pat Cipollone, I believe, additional information from him, and probably others. So I think he wanted to put in this indictment enough detail to sort of show support for these charges. But my guess is there's other information, and there may continue to be other information developed before this case is ultimately
Tim,
tried.
I know you have some thoughts about this whole notion of a speedy trial. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I find it really interesting that it seems like the strategy, Lester, will be delay. And I'm remembering Senator Stevens, Ted Stevens, who was charged in that same courthouse some years ago. He wanted a speedy trial because he believed he was innocent, and he asked for a trial within 70 days, which is his statutory right. Speedy Trial Act gives a defendant a right to trial within 70 days. He was tried, he was acquitted, and then he was reelected, in part because of his vigorous defense of the criminal charge. You would think that an innocent defendant would want a similarly fast opportunity to essentially rebut this evidence, be vindicated in a court of law, and sort of argue affirmatively that this was a sham prosecution or an overreach. I'm hearing, again, I don't have any inside information here, but it seems like the former president is taking the opposite approach and wants this delayed as long as possible. So as I hear that, I'm struck by the irony of that, and it's a little bit surprising given what we've seen with prior public corruption cases.
In fairness to the former president, and his defense attorney would say we need time to go over this mountain of evidence that they've had 3.5 years to go through, just to throw that out there. But Tim, what do you think about the structure of this indictment? It's a 4-count indictment. What it doesn't charge is anything approaching incitement. For example, the speech at the Ellipse, or beckoning a crowd that led to the violence of January 6th. Prosecutors aren't going there. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, there are a lot of options here. These facts arguably implicate many different criminal statutes. It seems to me that he chose the offenses which are most easily defined and understood, that eliminate issues like a possible First Amendment defense, incitement of an insurrection, aid and comfort to an armed rebellion. Those are hard terms to define. That statute has not been used in any of the other Jan 6 cases. So it seems as if, going back to the point about speedy trial, he is charging the president alone. A lot easier to get a speedy trial when it's one defendant versus 7, with counts that have been used repeatedly in Jan 6 cases that are most likely to be quickly adjudicated. That doesn't mean they're the only offenses that arguably apply. Those are the offenses that I think most closely match the conduct that he is relying upon.
All right, Tim Heaphy, thank you for being on with us today. I want to go back to Peter Alexander inside the courthouse. A reminder, this hearing is about to get underway, the arraignment of former President Trump. Peter, what more do you know?
Yeah, Lester, just a little more color from inside that courtroom. We are still waiting for the magistrate judge, Moksila Upadhyay, to arrive. It was scheduled or expected to start at about 4 o'clock. 10 minutes later, she is not yet in the courtroom, but certainly the former president of the United States is there, seated on the left side of the room at the defendant's table, alongside at least 2 of his attorneys. The prosecutors are on the right side. That front row, as we noted, is where Jack Smith, the special counsel, is seated. It's a striking scene that you can only imagine, the sort of tension inside that room, as Smith is someone who the former president, as sort of a political vehicle, has repeatedly attacked, as he is wont to do throughout the course of his presidency and the years since, describing him as deranged, a Trump hater, and a thug, among other things, despite no personal experience with Smith. And it's notable that even the former president, Donald Trump's former Attorney General Bill Barr just yesterday defended Jack Smith, saying though the two had not met, that he was an aggressive lawyer, and saying that it was his understanding from the Republican prosecutors that he knew that Smith was a strong lawyer and, in his words, was definitely not partisan. So a little bit of the color from inside the room right now. Here outside the courtroom, security remains tight as the former president is here right now with those snow plows and bike racks blocking off streets throughout this area. There are hundreds of individuals who have gathered here, so much because it's a scene more than because there is any protest or demonstration taking place. But again, just to sort of echo the remarkable nature, the monumental nature of what we're witnessing. And it's one thing to speak about it, it's another thing to see it. But literally just a couple football fields to my left is where the United States Capitol sits, the seat of democracy, what Jack Smith says the former president was trying to subvert America's democracy. And only a matter of blocks, a 20-minute walk the other way, is the White House. This is the very road that those Trump supporters, those MAGA faithful, the fanatics as some describe them, marched as they headed to the Capitol, the former president on that January 6th day saying that he would join them. And now inside this very courthouse, where as many as 1,000 or more of the criminal defendants from that day had proceedings, offered their pleas, and in some cases were found guilty, it is now the former president himself who is inside that courtroom as a criminal defendant.
All right, Peter, thank you.
And that's what brings us together this afternoon as the president is arraigned on these federal charges in Washington, D.C. Let's unleash the lawyers again for a moment here. As I see it, just listening to some of the defense lawyers making the rounds on TV, there are three defenses here. We talked about the First Amendment. They're saying he's being penalized, criminalized for First Amendment free speech. We talked a little bit about that. They're also saying he didn't have corrupt intent. He legitimately believed that he won the election fair and square and was just acting pursuant to that. We talked a little bit about that. He also says, I was advised by lawyers. One lawyer in particular, a lawyer named John Eastman, who we believe to be one of the unindicted co-conspirators here. How about that for a defense, Legal Beagle? Start with you, Laura.
That's going to be a gamble. And the reason it's a gamble is when you try to invoke advice of counsel, you waive any attorney-client privilege, which means you have opened Pandora's box into all the times Eastman told the former president, I think this is a little risky. Maybe it's even illegal. I'm not sure this is going to work. Why in the world would he want that on trial?
By the way, there is an email in the indictment where Eastman says, like, this is technically a violation of the law, but
he
we
says
can take
to
a
the
crack
former
at
vice
it.
president, put aside, he says to one of his aides, please put aside one of the minor violations of the Electoral Count Act to actually go ahead with this plan to overturn the election
But what
results.
about that? Because when you hear these lawyers out there making that argument, I think a lot of people connect with that idea. Like, hey, Trump's thinking, I'm not a lawyer. I got a lawyer telling me this is legit. There's also several other lawyers, including the Attorney General and his own White House counsel, saying it isn't. Exactly. But is that a valid argument?
It may not ultimately be successful, but I don't know that we should dismiss it completely out of hand yet. Number one, Trump doesn't have a lot of options for defenses. I mean, that's the reality of a criminal defense attorney. The prosecutor picks the facts that they want to indict. We have to take the facts as they're given to us, and that's why we have to get creative about our defenses. So, advice of counsel, look, it may not be great, but it might be one of his only options. And here's how that might go. Look, they'll try to prove that, hey, the Electoral Count Act, it's confusing. And there were people telling me that what I was planning, what they were doing was legitimate.
This is the alternative electors scheme.
Yes, exactly. And another part to the alternative electors, and I do believe the false electors scheme, I'm glad you said alternative, because I think that is key to their defense. I think the false electors scheme is probably the strongest case to be made, but the defense there will be, these were not false electors, they were alternate electors. Look, for example, at, I believe it was New Mexico, and I can't remember, it was Pennsylvania, where they included that conditional language. Those are states I think you're likely to never see charges brought against those electors. But contrast that to the state of Michigan, where the facts were much less conditional, much less alternate electors. And the evidence of that so far is that those electors have been indicted by the state of Michigan. But look for the defense to frame the false electors as alternate electors. You might hear people talking about 1960 in Hawaii, where Kennedy's electors had a ceremonial type submission, but that was under a court-ordered recount. And the argument there would be that the issue was much more in doubt. So therefore, Kennedy's electors were more permissible. That, the prosecution would say, if that even came into evidence somehow, they would say that that is markedly different from a case here where the electors should have known that they were false and not alternates. But make no mistake about it, that will be a central theme of the defense.
Trump's lawyers are already talking about it. They're citing that 1960 case. The facts are quite different. But the other issue, and we should mention, the court hearing is underway. The judge has entered the courtroom, so we will be getting live updates, and we'll hop in here as we continue our discussion. But I mean, this idea of the electors, there's a set that Danny is saying that said, okay, we're going to come in and we're the real elector, and we are the ones who are going to say it's actually Trump that won, not Biden. There's also an allegation in the indictment that some of these alternative electors, to borrow the words of the defense, actually didn't think they were going to be used unless there was a court ruling in their favor, which of course never happened.
Yes, and the allegation is essentially they were duped and that they were used as stooges. And I think one of them is even refers to himself as a useful idiot. And so the idea is partly, I think, that it morphed over time, because remember, some of this gets allegedly cooked up while there were still court challenges going on. But then the plan moves on and it morphs, and it goes on even well after all of the judges, in almost nearly 60 cases, had said there's no there there. And by the time that we get to the former vice president being pressured to actually accept these electors, all of the arguments had been essentially way gone in many ways, because the time where the electors had actually been scheduled to meet was on December 14th. So by the time you get to January 6th, there is no more need for alternate electors.
And Savannah,
not to bring us back to 10th grade social studies, but I do want to, we talk a lot about like electors and this and that. I mean, I think people know, we talk about the magic number being 270 for the Electoral College all the time on this set on election night. There is a process that happens when the TV cameras go off that is ceremonial. It is a formality. It is, largely, except for in 2020, right, when that was such a key piece of this plot. And that is these electors who, remember, are picked by the state parties. Different states have different mechanisms. These people, there's Republicans, there's Democrats, right? They go, they sign certificates, send them off to Congress, send them to the archives to say, this is who our state has picked. These are where, we give our electoral votes to this candidate. That is what this issue hinges on, that essentially the wrong party, right, in states that the Democrat Joe Biden won, the wrong party, the Republicans, tried to send they made fake certificates in many of these instances and send that off to say, no, look, this is what we think, we want to complicate the issue. Why? Ultimately, the thinking seemed to be to pressure then Vice President Mike Pence to say, well, look, I don't know. I mean, we have an issue. Maybe Mr. Trump should stay in power.
Let me interrupt just a second. Our Pony Express type reporting from the courtroom tells us that the former president is being sworn in right now. So that hearing is underway. We should hear more here piecemeal, and we'll keep bringing it to you. I do want to ask Chuck Rosenberg, the fact that the former president is still making those claims, I believe as recently as today, that the 2020 election was fraudulent, does that have any effect going forward on where the prosecutors take this?
I don't think it affects the trial per se, Lester. He'll continue to make contradictory and false statements if past his prologue. They will keep track of everything he says. One thing we do as prosecutors from day one is start to put together what we call a cross-examination file. So if a defendant gets on the stand, we have everything in one place ready to go. If I may add one thing to what Danny said. Danny's right. Defense attorneys offer defenses, and sometimes the only thing available to defense attorneys are imperfect defenses. Advice of counsel would be an imperfect defense, but I want to point out what I think are two structural problems with that defense. Structural problem number one, the people Mr. Trump relied upon for that quote-unquote advice are now among the 6 people specified in the indictment as unindicted co-conspirators. Each of them would have a Fifth Amendment problem if they were called to testify at trial. So it's not entirely clear where Mr. Trump goes to get witnesses who can testify to his state of mind and the advice they provided to him. Second, and relatedly, Lester, in order for Mr. Trump to really mount an advice of for Mr. Trump to really mount an advice of counsel defense, it would require him to take the stand. And if he takes the stand, he's going to be cross-examined. And if he's cross-examined, he's going to be eviscerated by skilled federal prosecutors. So I agree with Danny. There is a defense available. There almost always is. I agree with Danny. It's an imperfect one. But I think there are significant structural issues that Mr. Trump would have to surmount in order to offer that defense at trial.
Yeah, and Chuck is exactly right. In a sense, now Jack Smith has created a conundrum, a trap for Trump. If he wants advice of counsel, if he wants to raise that, he may have to take the stand. And maybe he thinks he can handle it, but I got news for you. I mean, they're going to be ready. They're going to be ready to cross-examine him, and it won't be good.
Well, it's harder than the toughest interview he's ever faced because the rules of evidence apply and will be litigated right then and there. It's interesting to hear Bill Barr, his former attorney general, last night asked if he were to take the stand. He said it would not go well for the former president. Hallie, you on your laptop, I understand, have notes coming in on Lester's Pony Express about what's happening in the court. Can you give us a little update?
I'll be transparent about it. It's our team inside that's sending stuff to us. So the hearing's been going on for about 7 minutes now. The judge came in, Donald Trump stood, raised his right hand, the whole 9 yards. She went through what this would look like, essentially. She said, I'm going to arraign you. I'll consider any conditions for release. We'll talk about next steps. She asked him to state his name. He did. She said, state your age. She said, he is 77, and that's what he told her. And now she is currently, as we speak, going through what the charges are. She is reading the list of charges. The former president, according to our team, is listening. He'd been consulting prior to the start of the hearing getting started with his attorneys. He was looking at some documents. She is now laying out, as we speak, I'm watching our team put it into this file right now, telling him what his rights are as a defendant here in a federal court proceeding. So this is where we are. Now, I should note, and I'll turn to Savannah, as you so aptly have named them our legal beagles. This is the arraignments go a certain way. They're conducted a certain way. This is, even though he's the former president, she's conducting this like an arraignment would happen.
It's pro forma.
Right.
It's a formal reading of the charges so that the defendant comes to court, appears, and it's a bedrock
Will
principle.
they set any dates?
I think they might do a holdover date for the next judge. This is the magistrate judge she's sort of a ceremonial judge, ministerial judge who does this administration. But this goes back to our founding fathers. I mean, speaking of our Constitution, which of course is at issue in this case, this is the notion that if the government, with all of its power, files a charge against you, you have a right to appear before a federal judge in court and hear those charges in open court. And the president is being advised of his rights under the Constitution. And he is answering to the question, do you understand that, sir? Yes.
Yeah, and he is talking way more this time around. Last time, obviously, his attorney did most of the talking for him. Every judge has a different practice. They have a lot of discretion for how they want to carry it out. Clearly, this magistrate has decided to have a little bit more of an interactive experience with the former president, which, again, is probably quite humbling to have to stand there and answer questions about being advised of your rights to remain silent and the like, and everything that another criminal defendant under any other circumstance would have to face. But this is obviously different.
You got more reporting?
Well, right now, I mean, as they speak, he is standing facing the judge. He has answered yes when she said, you have the right to remain silent. Do you understand, et cetera. He is now being arraigned, and the judge seems to be acknowledging the solemnity of the moment. She says an arraignment is a short proceeding, but it is an extremely important proceeding. His attorney says that, yes, the former president has received the indictment. That's a question that she will ask. And again, he is now apparently standing facing her. There's a microphone, so he's speaking into the microphone. And I'm just seeing that he is entering a plea. He said off mic, not guilty.
It's really interesting because I've been talking to people who don't necessarily support former President Trump, but who stress the importance of this process and the fact that he has strong legal counsel. Again, you got to talk to his lawyer, John Lauro. And I think that part of what we're also going to see focused on throughout these proceedings, we're talking about one co-conspirator, John Eastman, also the former president's other attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who was among those in his ear throughout this entire process. And during one of his cases where he went to court to say that this has been a fraudulent process, he said, we don't have facts, essentially, but we have theories. And it's just a reminder that the words that all of these people used around the former president are now coming back, are now in this very indictment.
Several of these unindicted co-conspirators are attorneys. Sidney Powell is another who we believe to be not named in the indictment, but in that indictment, Jeffrey Clark, another Department of Justice official. So it does, back to that issue of whether or not my lawyers told me XYZ will be a valid defense. You're a defense attorney, Danny. You're the guy who stands there in court every single day when you're not with us, with your clients. And that's a moment. When it's you and the judge reading you the charges, I don't care who you are, that is a solemn moment.
When we were talking about that moments ago, that this judge happens to be more involved, and that seems to be what's coming in over the wire here, I couldn't help but think about the fact that every time you tell a client, here's what you can expect, even at something like an arraignment, something unexpected may happen. Here are the questions that you should expect to be asked. In fact, I have the federal bench book right here in front of me. There is literally a script, and it sounds like from what Hallie's telling us, she's following the script, which is questions like, are you able to speak and understand English? It's short. It's probably about 8 or 9 questions, but you also never know when the judge will veer off script and start asking some interesting things in the middle of court. So you always have to be ready, and you have to manage your client's expectations.
And the client here, the defendant, Donald Trump, is being advised on this issue of witnesses, which came up in the Miami case, making clear you are not to speak to any witness in the case outside the presence of counsel.
And we wondered whether the judge would do it herself or whether prosecutors would raise it in some way. Last time around, prosecutors didn't say anything.
Well, who are the witnesses? I mean, are the witnesses delineated?
No, it just says in this case, and again, we're getting this in real time from our folks in the courtroom, the prosecutor saying the defendant must not communicate about the facts of this case to any individual known to be a witness except through counsel or in the presence of counsel. So it doesn't appear as though he's actually citing chapter and verse.
And that doesn't sound
witness.
like something the government asked for.
No, this is the government. Wyndham is the prosecutor who's asking for this, which is different from last time. So we'll have to get some more color about how that was exactly raised. But it's just interesting that they've changed their approach a little bit.
And there's not a witness list per se, but there's a good faith understanding of who are potential witnesses in this case.
Well, and last time the judge actually required the government to produce that witness list. We haven't seen it yet, but they are actually required to tell him, because otherwise it's like, well, there's a lot of witnesses. And so they're actually required to produce a physical witness list eventually.
The defense will get discovery. They'll discern who the witnesses are. Then they usually you hire an investigator. You send him out because you don't want the lawyers talking directly to the witness, because you don't want, as a lawyer, to be a potential witness yourself. That's why you send your investigator out. They do the contact.
I think it's worth noting while we're having this discussion about what's happening inside that courtroom, the politics continue. The former president's campaign just sent out this email. In reality, you're not after me, they're after you. I'm just in the way, with a big picture of former President Trump. And look, this theme that is now emerging front and center in this campaign is a lot of what we heard in 2016, different shades of it, of course, a lot of what we heard in 2020. And again, just a reminder that he is using each of these moments to bolster himself, to galvanize those core supporters who we've been talking about, who are immovable, and to try to bring more into the fold.
What a fascinating thing just happened in this courtroom. The judge bringing down the hammer, reminding it is a crime to influence a juror, the judge tells Trump. Well, what a fascinating thing when you were talking about someone who is running for federal office, who is talking about this case and has a First Amendment right to talk about this case. And in a sense, everyone listening in Washington, D.C., in that federal district, is a potential juror. How do you enforce something like that? And is it even fair?
Yeah,
it's not going house to house and saying, that we know would be a wrong influence, but speaking your case and saying your piece and federal jurors are listening?
It's one of those things. It's easy for the judge to admonish, and she should admonish the defendant not to try and influence jurors. But I'm sure even she is thinking in her head, what is this even going to look like? Because Donald Trump will not stop posting on social media. We know that. He will continue to try to influence people who may vote for him. So he's going to be speaking about this case. And I don't think any judge would try to tell him that he can't speak about this case. He has a First Amendment right to at least speak about his case if he wants to. Is it a good idea? I would advise him, no, do not talk about your case. Do not post on social media. But he has had a lot of very, very talented lawyers who have been completely unsuccessful in getting him to stop posting on social media. So he's going to do what he's going to do. And if he crosses the line, prosecutors will, of course, be watching.
Hallie, the mantra from the president and many of his closest allies has been this whole thing is political. All these cases coming now, trying to derail him, the strongest candidate against Joe Biden. And we haven't really talked a lot about the timing of all this. This is a lot happening at once. We could see a fourth indictment here in just the weeks to come. And for those folks looking with that eye at this, What's the answer? Is there any evidence that there is a political motivation?
None that we've seen. The Attorney General has defended on the federal level the actions of his department speaking about these federal indictments here and this now second federal arraignment that we're looking at. The issue of timing, I mean, listen, the lawyers would know this better than me, but it takes some time to do an investigation, to put a case together. Remember when the special counsel was put in place on this investigation? It was after former President Trump announced that he would again be a candidate for office. When you start to play out the calendar, and I'm sure it's marked in all our calendars when the Iowa caucuses are, when the New Hampshire primary, when all of these events are happening, the convention, he is on a collision course here. Now, these legal issues, his political fight to win back the White House is on a kind of collision course. I think it is worth noting, and you mentioned it, Lester, but even as we are literally getting new information in from this courtroom on his third indictment here on crimes, it is very likely, based on what we've heard publicly from the Fulton County District Attorney in Georgia, there will be a fourth indictment sometime before Labor Day. She has said she would make that announcement by September. And so the remarkable nature of this is you have a former president running for office, blowing everyone away in the polls. And let's be clear, we referenced it once, now almost 2 hours ago, 30 plus points. It is a stomp. I mean, that's not close. And he is going to be running, facing these challenges and these trial dates, et cetera. I mean, we haven't seen this.
And in a lot of ways, if you talk to people inside Trump world, they're really concerned about this fourth indictment, despite the defiance, despite where we started this conversation with Mr. Trump posting on Truth Social, all I need is a fourth indictment to win re-election. There is this outside concern about the weight of all of this, not necessarily in the primary, but in the general election. How does this play out? If you look at the polling right now, former President Trump is running neck and neck with President Biden. But if you delve into the numbers more deeply, you see that Mr. Biden has a slim lead in some of these key groups like independents, African Americans, women voters, although also worth noting his lead is a little bit smaller than it was back in 2020.
You have to wonder how much of that is people just seeking a rematch.
Exactly.
It's you know, Frazier versus Ali.
Which very few people have an appetite for based on what we're seeing in the numbers. And I think there is a frustration with the fact that it's shaping up to potentially be these two options yet again.
No. Let's go back to the courtroom and get our latest there, Hallie.
It looks like they are trying to figure out when the next date is. Savannah, you asked about dates. We can't really say what it is yet. They're still trying to figure out when the first hearing before now Judge Chutkan, who, as you've noted, is going to be the one actually overseeing this case. We've seen already Donald Trump, says he understands the consequences of the conditional release, signed some documents. It's, again, pro forma stuff that would typically happen. That has gone down. And it looks like we are nearing the end at this point. When we have a date, we'll share it.
Let's talk about that potential Georgia case. We don't know that. We know that the Georgia special grand jury has met, investigated. We know there's an investigation there. We don't know whether or not the president will be the subject of an indictment there. We don't know that. It's not clear. We did know that in this federal case because he received that target letter that essentially says as much. What would the case be in Georgia? We see some of the Georgia evidence is actually in this federal indictment. It's in there. But what would the case be?
Based off of what I think is at least publicly been reported, having to do essentially with the call that he made to the Georgia Secretary of State saying, find me 11,780 votes. And the argument was that was a solicitation to commit a crime, to try to find votes that were either did not exist or to either put out in the sphere in some sort of fraudulent way, that there was voter fraud when there had not been. We'll have to see exactly what the contours of her case are. And if, in fact, the former president is indicted, if anybody else in his sphere is indicted. We've talked about how we think the special counsel likely did not include other people here, perhaps to make the case go faster. Does the Georgia DA go to the same way? It's not clear. She might not be facing the same sort of time constraints or have the same considerations.
We have the next court date. It's August 28th, and the judge has allowed the president to waive his personal appearance if he wants to. It's interesting. August 28th is his next court date in this matter. August 23rd is the first Republican debate.
I was just going to say.
Unclear, though, if he's going to waive his appearance there, too.
That's right. I talked to a source close to the former president just today who said he's still not planning to attend. This is significant because he's been lobbied by the folks who are running this first debate to attend just this week. But I'm told he's still holding at this decision not to attend the first debate. The reason why is because, of course, he knows he's going to be the target. The question for all of us who will be covering this first debate is to what extent, and he will be the center of the targets undoubtedly, of a number of the the other candidates, but can anyone break away? Will anyone have a breakout moment without him on the stage, without that foil there? And I think politically speaking, it's going to be interesting. He's quipped he might use the first debate to pick his potential VP nominee. We'll have to see.
Well, he's confident, and that's the reason why. There's the poll numbers, 54%. If you're Chuck Todd, if you're Donald Trump and you're running away with it right now, why would you go to a debate?
No, you wouldn't. I mean, it would be political malpractice to do that when you're up by this much, because the whole point is why, especially when you look at Ron DeSantis right now. I mean, he's a guy that looks like he's struggling to get to shore. Like, why throw him a life raft, right? Which is, he desperately needs an event that makes it look like he's got a shot to beat Trump. Well, why give him the venue? So, makes no sense to me. And this, by the way, this is not unusual. George W. Bush was the front runner in 2000. He didn't go to the first couple of debates. Front runners, a lot of times when you're the front runner, you don't have to. It's quite common. It would be, I think, odd if he did attend the first or second debate. I don't expect him in a debate until closer to November or December.
All right, let's go back to Hallie briefly. You've getting a little more data from the courtroom.
Well, it speaks to a point that Savannah made before about the sheer amount of evidence, of documents, of information and discovery. The former president's attorney says there is a massive amount of discovery. They're asking for basically the prosecution, the government to give us an understanding of the magnitude of discovery here. They need to figure out, get their arms around how much is out there and what they need to prepare for.
Well, it's interesting because this is the attorney, John Laura, who's saying there's this mountain of evidence. Give us a crack at it. We got to do the discovery. We got to get our hands on it, too. He did say when he was on the Today Show earlier this week, hey, they've had 3.5 years to investigate. Shouldn't we get the same? Which is fascinating, and also probably a disputable statement, as the special counsel just was not impaneled 3.5 years ago. But I don't think a judge would have let it go that long. Do you, Danny? 3.5 years?
Not a chance.
Yeah.
For several reasons. Number one, single defendant case. Number two, we're in federal court. It moves much more quickly. We talked about the Speedy Trial Act. That is a right to a speedy trial. It is not a right to a delayed trial. Criminal defendants in federal court simply don't have that right. I would add that the special counsel, I believe, didn't get on the case until November of last year. So it's not as if they've been investigating. This special counsel's office has been investigating it for that long. I mean, there is a fair argument on the Trump side, I think, that it has been 2.5 years. But look, you're within, most federal statutes of limitations are 5 years. So if you're within that statute, it sounds like we're about halfway through, then that's not you don't really have much of an argument there either. This happens fairly often in federal court. It's just understood when you're the defense, you've got to get ready faster. You've got to go through terabytes of documents. There's a lot of documents, and that's just life in federal court. That's why a lot of criminal defense attorneys don't like being in federal court, me included.
That's where the statement, it's a federal case, comes from. Now we understand. Laura, would there be any bar to this Judge Chutkan? Let's say she thinks it's fair for the trial to start in January. We know there's a trial starting in May that Judge Cannon down in Florida has set. Is there some, courtesy they have with one another?
She can obviously...
Can she preempt?
Absolutely. There's no rule that says just because the case in Florida came first, that the trial, therefore, has to go first. And it appears, at least from what we're piecing together here, that Judge Chutkan is all over this case already. So at least from what we're piecing together, that the magistrate judge actually talked to Judge Chutkan, and they actually had a conversation about scheduling to make sure that August 28th date would be available.
And it was Judge Chutkan who said to the magistrate judge, and he can waive his personal appearance. He didn't have to come here. This is a formality.
So again, we're already seeing the signs of her wanting to keep this on track, and it appears that she actually might set the trial date on that August 28th date when they all come in. So she might be ready, even at this early stage, to set the trial date, ready to go. Again, I think these are all just sort of signals of how she's going to move this expeditiously.
Let's take you back to Washington outside the courthouse. Peter, more color, more information from the courtroom.
Yeah, that's right. We're now 25 minutes into this arraignment as it appears to be wrapping up, that the court clerk introduced as the United States of America versus Donald J. Trump. As you have noted, the next court date has been set for August 28th. Only thing that's striking to me there is there were 3 days that the judge had discussed as possible options: August 21st, August 22nd, or August 28th. The prosecution asked for the nearest date, August 21st. The defense asked for August 28th. It was August 28th, that Monday, that the judge decided on. So it's clear that the prosecution was looking to get things moving. The defense was glad to push things back as far as they could. Again, as things wrap up right now, we are hearing from this magistrate judge that the judge, Tanya Chutkan, does intend to set the trial date during that next hearing where the former president does not need to attend on the 28th of August. And some of the key takeaways that you guys have been discussing in a room where there are 4 Secret Service members standing by the door that the former president entered. We're learning some new details about the situation when the former president arrived. Jack Smith, we were told by our colleague Ken Delaney, who was watching the proceedings inside. Jack Smith did not look up at the former president as he entered. He was the only face not to do so, as the entire courtroom bent its head in the former president's direction. Then, after the former president took his seat at the defense table, we're told that Jack Smith did give him a look, started staring over at the defendant in this case, now a criminal defendant. But those are the key takeaways as we watch the final details here from inside. The president, as you've noted, has had it communicated to him that he cannot interfere in any way, cannot try to influence any jurors, and cannot interact with any of the witnesses in this case, which is notable because the president does have personal relationships with many of these individuals still, and we still don't know who the 6th co-conspirator is, but there is a belief, according to some reports right now, that he may be someone with whom the president routinely travels. If that's the case, that does pose a little bit of a challenge for the president right now, which is to say it's still a current advisor of the former president. All things to keep a close eye on as we watch the way this legal matter proceeds.
All right, Peter, thank you for that update.
You know, as we're watching some of the information, the judge is now out of the courtroom. As Peter has noted, this was a sort of remarkable 30 minutes, almost exactly, that we've seen this hearing. And the defense attorney for former President Trump, Savannah, frankly, scooped it on the Today Show right there with you. What he's saying to the judge, he's saying, we need more time. He said, the U.S. has had 3.5 years to investigate this matter. We have fact-checked that, asking for the opportunity to have a chance to have a fair trial here. You've heard the prosecution say, we will have a fair and speedy trial as required by law.
And President Trump, former President Trump, has now left the courtroom. This lawyer also says for the government to suggest that we can go to court in 70 days is just absurd, which, be that as it may, the government cannot, as a point of fact, cannot force the defendant to go to trial in 70 days. We've discussed that amply.
I think that one of the things, as we think about the weight of this moment, is, do the American people need to see this trial before they go to the polls, if there is, in fact, this rematch that we are talking about the possibility of? And I think that, I don't know that that will impact the legal proceedings, but I think certainly it will be one of the themes that hangs over what is just a very heavy, somber, serious moment in this country.
It's interesting because the defense, is Chuck Rosenberg still with us? I wanted to ask him this question as former federal prosecutor, former U.S. attorney. Chuck, if you're with us, there you are. Wave. The attorneys, another thing that they're saying out in the press, said on our air, is this is going to be a total and complete relitigation of the 2020 election. So if you love the dead voters allegedly in Michigan, or the this and the that, and all of those allegations, all of it, he's saying that we're going to have to come in and try that case. And what is the likelihood that those issues would be allowed into trial? The defense, I assume, would argue, look, this goes to the question of whether he legitimately believed and had a rational basis to believe that the election was fraudulent and therefore his conduct was justified.
Yeah, good question, Savannah. So I find it very hard to believe that a federal district court judge is going to permit the relitigation in her courtroom of 6 cases from around the country. They have been resolved. There's a federal rule of evidence that I believe is right on point, Federal Rule of Evidence 403. Evidence that is more prejudicial than probative is barred from a court. So I think defense lawyers, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, and I say it mindful of the fact that Danny is a colleague. Defense lawyers say lots of things, and they write lots of things, and they argue lots of things. That is their duty to their client. That doesn't mean it's going to fly. The notion that they would relitigate the 2020 election in Judge Chutkan's courtroom, I would say the odds of it are pretty close, if not zero.
How about it? He's saying defense lawyers are going to defense lawyer, Danny.
No, he's right. And the 403 test is something that defense lawyers often lose when they're trying to introduce evidence that they think could possibly help their client. But look, Chuck is exactly right. We have to play the facts as they're given to us, and we have to get creative. And sometimes we try to introduce evidence that the prosecution objects to. The judge has to conduct a balancing test. And it can go either way. It just often goes against the defense attorney. But that's just my personal observation. But Chuck is exactly right. That doesn't mean that the defense still should not try to introduce this evidence. They need to. They need to try and get it in. And look, 403 is a balancing test. So what one judge might admit, another judge might not. But generally, federal judges don't let defense attorneys get as creative as we sometimes get in state court.
But what evidence are we even talking about? Like, what is the hard evidence that they would even introduce to try to shore up their case? If anything, I would think in front of a jury it would hurt them if they tried to introduce
if you want
things
to gum
about
up the
dead
works,
voters.
well, perhaps. I mean, but what it would certainly do is extend the entire process. Let's be clear about that. But
yes.
also, if the argument is, I'm not a defense lawyer, but if the argument is he doesn't have corrupt intent, he legitimately believed the election was stolen. This was all the evidence arrayed that he saw. Here's what he saw. You don't have to prove that that case was won. You just have to prove that there was a legitimate basis for his belief.
I think some of it prosecutors are going to introduce themselves to show how unreasonable the belief was. I think some of it is going to be sort of all of these phony affidavits and other things that Giuliani and others were collecting to show, look at all of this. Who would have believed any of this? I think is going to be some of the prosecutors.
This goes to a really important point here, which is the importance of a judge in the case. It's incredibly important because the judge has not only the ability to set the schedule and do you have a right to further delay, but to narrow the issues, and that can be the whole ball game.
Absolutely.
Right. Just to reset where we are, the former president has left the courtroom. He pleaded not guilty to all the counts that were read in open court to him. But again, as far as we know, the proceeding is over. He has left the courtroom, and we expect him to fly back to New Jersey. Let's go to Garrett Hake, who's outside the courtroom. He can bring us more. Garrett?
There we go. Well, Lester, I just ran down the courthouse steps to get out here, having been in the courtroom. The proceeding's over, about 27 minutes from start to finish. Frankly, a much more relaxed atmosphere in this courtroom than what I saw in Miami or in New York. Unlike in Miami, everyone was seated in this courtroom by the time Mr. Trump was let in. And he was left to wait for about 15 minutes before the judge entered the chambers and started the procedure. You could tell he was a little bit frustrated to have to sit there and wait. He chatted with his attorneys, looking around the room. He appeared to notice that Jack Smith was sitting there, keeping a very close eye on him, but went to some length to look basically everywhere else in the room rather than at Smith. It was also a much more participatory hearing than either of the other two arraignments. Mr. Trump had to answer several questions from the judge, twice taking an oath that his answers would be honest and that he would also follow the conditions of his release that were set at the end of this hearing. He himself pleaded not guilty, not through his attorney, as had been the case in Miami. And at the end of this hearing, I was just very noticeable dynamic. He was fairly quick to leave the room thereafter. Jack Smith, the special counsel, stayed in the courtroom for some time, kind of laughing and chatting, talking with the prosecutors in the room. Just a very interesting interpersonal dynamic between these two men at the center of all of this.
Hey, Garrett, I'm curious about the admonishment that the judge delivered regarding influencing jurors. I don't have the wording in front of me here, but that's not something we typically hear, is it?
Well, Lester, I'm not as familiar with the ins and outs of this particular court as I should be to answer whether that's a totally pro forma warning or not. But it obviously takes on, additional meaning here, given the nature of this case, the nature of the obstruction element of this, and the nature of the behavior of this defendant, who we know likes to use his social media platform in particular to talk about witnesses, to talk about people he thinks are disloyal to him. So, and frankly, as we've seen done in the New York case. So I do think that admonishment was notable, and notable that it was attached with, warnings and specific penalties for what could happen if Mr. Trump is found not to be following that particular condition along with all the others of his release.
Yeah, we're seeing the motorcade leave now longer than the one we had seen in Miami, so he's added some travelers. I think there might be members of the press pool following this motorcade as he leaves the courthouse. And we talked earlier about the debates, the effect on Republican candidates and the conundrum they face. Nikki Haley putting out her first statement since the Tuesday indictment, saying basically she didn't feel the need to rush out with a statement because she's tired of commenting on every Trump drama. And I think that gets to what Republican candidates are dealing with now. How much do you have to talk about this?
Lester, it gets to the heart of the frustration that so many Republican candidates are dealing with and that so many Republicans on Capitol Hill are dealing with, that their entire work revolves around responding to former President Trump and his controversies, and now in this case, his legal battles. And again, this is a major test for each and every one of these GOP candidates. We know how Chris Christie is conducting his campaign.
Trump blocks out the sun for every other issue that Republicans want or don't want to talk about. Do you think that the former president will speak after this indictment today? We saw it happen before.
He sure has after the other indictments. Remember what happened when he was in Florida? He went to Versailles, that very famous Cuban restaurant, to speak.
Here. Can you repeat that again? I'm sorry.
He's going to speak from the airport, they just said.
He's going to speak from the airport.
Okay.
So now it's confirmed. And look, he turns these moments into campaign events, right? And this is his way again of saying, I'm not fighting for me, I am fighting for you. And that is a familiar Trumpian theme.
It's the political, a good defense is a good offense. And clearly that is the art of the political strategy here, Hallie.
I just want to point out what we're watching on screen. So this is obviously members of the motorcade traveling through Washington. They just went through a tunnel literally underneath the Capitol, underneath the U.S. Capitol building. We've talked about how close the courthouse has been to this, you say, Savannah, the scene of the alleged crime. I mean, they are crisscrossing that path. He's going to be at the airport, driven this many a time, in probably about 6 minutes with a motorcade, so we're not too far away from those remarks.
Yeah. I'm also struck by the disparity between Trump inside the courtroom versus the Trump that we are about to see when he steps before the microphone in the courtroom, following, of course, the protocols, as Garrett said, maybe getting a little bit frustrated while he was waiting for the judge. But compliant when he needs to be, and then obviously a very different personality. And I think that those who are close to the former president would say something similar, that when you are in a room with former President Trump, he can be someone who is not only cordial, but who's, someone who's enjoyable to engage with, and yet the bombast, the attacks, that's really what he's made a signature piece of his campaigning.
Let's go to Chuck Todd, who has been sending me on text very fascinating suggestions about this notion of witnesses. Okay, we talked about it, and the judge has made clear the defendant is not to try to speak with witnesses. However, these unindicted co-conspirators, many of them are people that Donald Trump knows, and some of them may be people that he continues to associate with. For example, Jason Miller, his top advisor, who is in that motorcade right now, is in the indictment, is a potential witness. There are others. So, Chuck, I'm gonna let you set it up with some of the questions. Right. They're very enticing, and then I'm gonna let the real lawyers answer what they think might happen here. Chuck.
Well, we know Mike Pence is a witness, and if they are on a debate stage together, this is likely to come up. Right, so that would be question one for all the lawyers on set there. Is that a violation of the order, right? If they're actually having a conversation
about the facts of the case.
That's number one.
Yeah.
But to me, this is the real question I'm asking. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. If you're an unindicted co-conspirator, number one, does the government inform you? That's a question I have. Number two, if you're Donald Trump, you've been told you cannot interact with these witnesses, right, on this case. But if they haven't told, let's say, I don't want to name that, but there's a person that one news organization has identified as co-conspirator number 6. We do not have enough information to go with that. If that is indeed the case, doesn't the government have a duty to inform the defendant, in this case, former President Trump, hey, by the way, a guy that travels with you all the time is unindicted co-conspirator number X. You cannot talk with him. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
You can't entrap him. Does the government have a duty to inform him of these folks?
So they will produce a list, Chuck, of all of the witnesses who would be off limits. I think the scenario you raise about the debate stage is interesting, but in reality, someone has to bring the violation to the court's attention. And the court did admonish him there today. Look, if you violate this order, could actually be arrested and held in custody for that. And so it's a serious admonition that she's giving him, that you have to follow this sort of no contact order. But in reality, I don't think the debate stage would be a violation. I think they're really contemplating is something far more nefarious, which is actually sort of trying to coordinate on testimony. Right. In answer to your other question, the government is under no obligation to say to any of the alleged unindicted co-conspirators, hey, we didn't name you in this, but you actually are unindicted co-conspirator number 2. Having said that, I think it's probably fair to guess that these people know who they are. Many of them have been before the grand jury. Many of them have certainly talked with federal prosecutors in different settings, as we know, and we've reported on Rudy Giuliani going in for a proffer session on at least 2 different occasions with the special counsel's office. So go ahead, Leslie.
Yeah, let me bring Carol Lamb, a former federal prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst, to weigh in on this issue of what that order means. Was it perfunctory, or was it directed at this particular defendant because of past history?
I think it probably was brought. It was probably brought in because of this particular defendant. Although there may be instances in other cases where there's been some hint of some sort of getting people's stories together. But I think, Lester, that this was really more prophylactic in nature. And what I mean by that is that the judge, Judge Chutkan, who's going to hear this case as the sitting federal district judge, she doesn't want to have this distraction in the future. She's basically issued a warning. I think Laura's exactly right, that in reality, we're not talking about a debate stage or anything. We're talking about a surreptitious or corrupt attempt to influence testimony. It would have to rise to that level before the district judge would find some sort of violation of the conditions of release. So I think that this was really a warning shot. Don't make trouble. Don't make me have to do things that distract us from this trial. I think that's what we're really talking about.
We will get some idea of his ability to self-edit here shortly when the former President Trump addresses the camera there before he boards the plane back to his home in New Jersey. There's the picture from the motorcade that made their way. You guys tell me which parkway it is.
There's the airport signs there.
Oh, yeah. Right there. Okay.
He's close.
There's a parkway that you go into the airport. That's the road you're on.
On the way to Reagan National Airport, which is also very close to the courthouse and the Capitol and the center of Washington, D.C. This lawyer talk is really interesting, Laura, because down in Florida, there are co-defendants. And there are cases where the lawyering is getting cross-contaminated, so to speak. What's legal, what isn't legal. You have cases where I think the former president's legal defense fund is paying for the counsel for some of his co-defendants. So the plot thickens. That's permitted, by the way. It's not illegal.
And the special counsel's office is all over this, already bringing it to the judge's attention. There are certainly plenty of times where you can imagine a corporation pays for the legal defense of its employees. Happens all the time. Nothing inherently illegal or nefarious about that. The situation that we have here, the prosecutors are worried about, is that you have lawyers representing both a cooperator and someone who has now been indicted. And you cannot have a lawyer cross-examining a former client about things that they know because they were his lawyer.
Isn't there some ethical prohibition as well?
There's ethical
a lawyer's not supposed to have
ethical prohibitions. But for people at home who might be wondering, why in the world does Jack Smith care about that? Because if, in fact, the client decides to get hip to the fact that there might have been an issue with their counsel and perhaps maybe they weren't advised properly, the whole case can fall apart because the person has a Sixth Amendment right to effective counsel. And if they can show, oh, actually, my counsel wasn't actually giving me the best advice because they were represented by somebody else who had other interests at plan, and those are adverse interests, then Jack Smith loses this whole case if those cases fall apart. So that's why Jack Smith is the one raising this issue about potential conflicts. That's why he's the one who's interested in it.
He's going to try to get ahead of it. We're just coming up now on the top of the hour, 5 o'clock East Coast time, Washington, D.C., and we're watching this motorcade arrive at Reagan National Airport. And we are expecting to hear from the former president, set to speak after he just pleaded not guilty to all 4 counts in a Washington, D.C. courtroom. The case there, his alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election.
He is set to speak, as we noted, at the airport soon. His arraignment wrapped up a few minutes ago at a federal courthouse 1 block away from the Capitol. He left the courthouse. He's now making his way back to his property in New Jersey, pulling onto the private terminal there at Washington National Airport, where he will make the remarks and then board his personal plane back to New Jersey. The whole hearing, we're told, lasted about 27 minutes, but it is the third arraignment, third indictment of this former president, and perhaps the most serious, as it accuses a former president of the United States with essentially trying to block the lawful transfer of power.
Yeah, the arraignment is the formal reading of the charges, a plea of not guilty from the defendant, former President Trump. And the judge also set an August 28th date. This will be the first hearing in the case that will go over to Judge Chutkan, who will preside over the trial. The judge, as is expected in any arraignment, went over the counts, went over the penalties, made an admonition about not trying to influence a juror in any way. This judge took pains to say that is a violation of the law, talked about not talking to witnesses. So all of that took place in an arraignment that in some ways was quite ordinary and in every other way quite extraordinary. Garrett Haake was inside the courtroom. Garrett, tell us about what it was like inside that courtroom. You've got Jack Smith right there, and you have the former president of the United States, protected by Secret Service, I might add, right there as well.
Yeah, that's right. Savannah, I've been in all 3 of these arraignments, and I have to tell you, with each of these, it's felt a little more normal in the weirdest way. And I think you can see that in the countenance of the former president when he's in these courtrooms, too. In New York, he was tight. He was tense. He didn't look around the room. He just sort of glowered and looked straight ahead. In Miami, same kind of thing. He went to great lengths not to look in Jack Smith's direction. He didn't seem chatty, even with his own attorneys. He was very tight. In this case, he made a point to be seen kind of looking around, making eye contact with people, basically everyone in the room except Jack Smith. The security posture in this courtroom felt, if not looser, a little bit more relaxed. They had seen how this has been done in other courtrooms and had their own strategy for handling it. And there was a spectator aspect to it. In the courtroom were family members of the presiding magistrate judge, other judges from this district, and their family members were seated in the back of the courtroom too. They wanted to come and see what was going to happen in this room. So that feeling was very noticeably different, I think, than what we saw in these other arraignments. But the one thing that I think was consistent between Miami and this was Jack Smith's presence. I mean, Smith has said so little publicly during all of this, by design, by the nature of his role, but he does kind of command the room. He made a point to be seen sort of staring in Donald Trump's direction almost the entire time that Trump was in the room. He was very clearly looking at him from across the room on the prosecution side. And when Donald Trump and his entourage, including, by my count, at least 9 Secret Service agents and 1 aide, left the courtroom at the conclusion of the hearing, Smith stayed and made a point to shake hands with even junior members of the team. He was laughing. He was smiling. He was showing that sort of this is a home game for the Justice Department, and that certainly seemed to be the feeling in the room, at least as I absorbed it.
And we're waiting for former President Trump now to emerge from the airplane. His Secret Service agents and staff waiting there. We saw the cameras moving and shaking as members of the campaign press corps were making their way to the actual aircraft.
For a minute, I thought my child was on FaceTime. That's what that shot looked like. That's pretty much the same feel, but we've steadied up now, and we now wait for the emergence of the former president, who's going to make brief remarks, we're told, here after his 3rd indictment. Let's take a step back here, and please, Laura, keep an eye on this, because when he speaks, we, of course, want to stop. The strength of the case, the Mar-a-Lago documents case versus this case that we see. I think he's walking up to the mic, so hold that thought. Love to hear what you think about that.
This is a very sad day for America, and it was also very sad driving through Washington, D.C. and seeing the filth and the decay and all of the broken buildings and walls and the graffiti. This is not the place that I left. It's a very sad thing to see it. When you look at what's happening, this is a persecution of a political opponent. This was never supposed to happen in America. This is the persecution of the person that's leading by very, very substantial numbers in the Republican primary and leading Biden by a lot. So if you can't beat him, you persecute him or you prosecute him. We can't let this happen in America. Thank you very much.
Do you want these trials to happen before the 2024 election?
That's it. Some of those comments we may have expected, saying it was a sad day for America. Some we probably didn't expect, and his comments about the situation in Washington, D.C., graffiti and decay, as he described it.
Taking a shot at the local leadership there in Washington on his way out the door. He just made the central argument that he's making
right,
here.
that's it.
It's weaponizing the justice story. They don't want him to win, so they're going after him using the judicial system. That is an argument that many, many Republican voters are currently buying.
Absolutely. And I think the most surprising thing about what we just saw is how short it was. He didn't take questions. We know he likes to mix it up with the press. It underscores, I think, part of what Garrett was reporting that he witnessed inside the courtroom, which was that former President Trump was very serious and a bit somber. But Savannah, this is the crux of his argument. Republicans are believing it. That's why Jack Smith came out and defended this indictment. And he only spoke very briefly as well, but also defended the Justice Department, defended this investigation. And this is going to be an ongoing theme throughout this campaign. That's why, by the way, President Biden is not commenting on this, not on this indictment or any of the other indictments. He doesn't want to feed into the narrative that he is in some way linked to this.
It wouldn't be appropriate for any defendant. I mean, you don't see a president commenting on any criminal case,
Did we
let
just
alone
hear caution, though?
libel.
Did we just hear a note of caution in his remarks, the fact that he kept it short and stuck to just those talking points he's been hanging on to?
He could also just be, I'm just going to say, he could just be in a mood, right? I mean, and that's what we've seen from Donald Trump, is that he very much does what he wants to do in the moment that he wants to do it. So yes, it is entirely possible that his attorney said to him, hey, like, let's keep this brief, let's stick to some kind of a script, but it's also possible that the former president is just doing what he wants. Here's the thing, though, clip and save that. Play it at this next rally coming up this weekend, both nights. I mean, that is what you're going to hear, to Savannah, your point, again and again. You talk about the idea that this is potentially politically persuasive to Republican primary voters. I hear that in conversations with Republicans, across the spectrum. You look at the erosion of trust in the Department of Justice, in the FBI. It has been substantial, and it is real when you look at how few Republicans have a degree of trust in either of those institutions.
What I also hear from some Republicans is exactly what Hallie is saying, and then privately they say, and yet we don't think that former President Trump should be the nominee. That is the type of dichotomy, that is the type of challenge I think that Republicans are dealing with right now, this internal battle inside the party.
Well, let's talk about the cases here, because now the arraignment on the third indictment is done. We've got 3 cases going. The Manhattan hush money case, it's a state court case. You have the federal case in the Southern District of Florida and Florida Mar-a-Lago having to do with the mishandling of classified documents. And now we have this third indictment that, as I said before, it goes to the heart of the matter, this issue of whether or not the former president tried to remain in power in contravention of our Constitution and the law. Judging the merits of these cases, just in terms of the evidence that we see in the indictment, it seems to me that the Florida indictment is the tightest and the strongest. This Washington indictment is the most important.
I would agree with you. I think the Florida case is just the cleanest. It's not nearly as complicated. Yes, it involves classified documents, which maybe not everybody at home is familiar with, but the general allegation is he took the documents he wasn't supposed to have and then tried to delete the video when asked to return them.
And
That's
the
a
indictment
simple
makes it look like they got it all. Audio, witness testimony, surveillance video. It looks like they have it cold in terms of the evidence. Much more tricky issues in this indictment in Washington.
It doesn't involve the same sort of complex questions about his state of mind. It's just a question of, did he take the documents when he wasn't supposed to or not? And I'm just reminded, we saw on that video, Walt Mata, a co-defendant, his longtime valet and aide, is the one handing him the umbrella when he's getting on the plane there. And it just reminds you, again, we've talked about how inextricably linked he is to all of these people who are either witnesses or, in this case, a co-defendant who he's not supposed to be talking about the facts of the case with, but yet is there traveling with him all the time, handing him an umbrella.
Let's talk about those comments being persecuted. We noted that that's going to be the mantra. It has been the mantra up until a trial. Does it have any effect on or telegraph what the defense is going to do and how they're going to defend?
Again, you get into sort of this query about arguments that he makes in sort of the public sphere, for public consumption, versus arguments that will actually be made in court. And the political prosecution one, I don't think is one that you're going to actually hear his lawyers stand up and make in court, but certainly it is, I will let Kristen weigh in on this, but it certainly plays well for him politically, and he fundraises off of every time that we have one of these arraignments. And so it is certainly a narrative that we're going to see, but I don't think it's a legal argument that you're actually going to hear his lawyers
How about
make.
it, defense lawyer Danny Savalas? Would you try that one? Do you think you could get a judge to allow you to say this is political persecution? That's what this is about.
That's the key, is getting it in. But if you can get this kind of evidence in, you're going to try and get in evidence of, for example, 1960 in Hawaii. Maybe you try to get in evidence of Jamie Raskin. You remember that he stood up and objected to electors. Maybe you try to make that point. But the problem is getting that kind of evidence in. So you do it another way. You do put on, if you can, if it's allowed in, you put the election itself on trial. And if you can't do it directly, you crowbar it in the side any way you can. And you do that by marching in any witnesses you can to show that Donald Trump was told time and again that there were problems with the election, and that should he have done a follow-up? Should he have investigated more? No, he relied on people around him. Then also you look to have Donald Trump blame if, for example, someone alleges that a co-conspirator pushed some of this election fraud in other states. You say, well, that was him doing it. Now, you asked about the order of these cases. Here they are, 1 to 4. I'll give them to you. Number 1, Mar-a-Lago. That is the strongest case by far. Number 2 and number 3, kind of a toss-up, but this case in D.C. is number 2. The main reason that 1 and 2 are federal cases is that federal prosecutors win. They do not lose. They win 95% of the time. So playing the odds, I put them 1 and 2. Now here, you're wondering, what is my 4th? Well, it's a case that isn't even brought yet. It is Fulton County. That I'm putting at number 3, and that's a case that isn't even a case yet. That shows you how highly or lowly I regard the New York State case. It is coming in at number 4.
Yeah, because that's the hush money case that relies, among other things, on a rather novel legal theory that hasn't been tested at all. Let's throw up the poll numbers again, if we can, because as we turn to you, Kristen, none of these Republican rivals have laid a glove on Donald Trump, and some haven't even tried on this issue, which is potentially the most potent issue to raise against him. And look at that poll. You can add up all of the other candidates, and there are more than we're showing you there. They don't add up to even, if you combine them all, they don't get the number that Donald Trump has right now.
And a lot of people look at those numbers and say, this is 2016 all over again. They were afraid to attack him back in 2016. Remember that? We said, when are the GOP rivals going to take the gloves off? They haven't done it yet. We talked about Mike Pence sharpening his tone. But Ron DeSantis, his closest rival, the person who has a chance potentially to catch up to him, hasn't really sharpened his tone and made an issue of these cases. I do think the argument you'll start to see is that there's a pile-up factor. That'll be the big question.
Well,
You'll start to hear that.
Some have attacked the process of these prosecutions. But not him.
But even if you want to walk that fine line that some are saying, okay, they don't want to alienate the base, so they're signing on to the notion of it's weaponized, and what about Hunter, and what about this, that, and the other? Why is no Republican rival saying, can we just agree that this person's got a lot of baggage? And you know what? We liked his policies too. I know you like him. I get it. But this is a hot mess. How is he supposed to be focused on you when he's focused on not 1, not 2, but 3 indictments, possibly 4?
That is the argument that we'll have to see if these candidates start to make in this first debate. Ron DeSantis has inched close to making that argument, but not in a strong way. A lot of people say maybe it's a slap on the wrist. Will he get tougher? By the way, a lot of people are focused on Tim Scott. They say he's got some momentum. Watch for him, but he hasn't come close.
But subtlety does not work. Why don't these Republican rivals?
They're afraid. They're afraid of alienating his base. But the thing that doesn't exactly square with that is that the gettable votes in the Republican Party are not Trump's base. They're never going to be gettable. They're the moderate voters in the middle who might be receptive to that argument, but only if you had every single candidate pile on a chorus of voices saying this cannot stand. Someone who has this many indictments.
And you'd need a one-on-one race, not a 1 versus 16 other rivals.
Donald Trump and his traveling party now about to depart National Airport after that 27-minute arraignment in Washington, D.C., going back to his estate in New Jersey.
Well, that concludes this NBC News special report. We thank our panel, all of our guests. We have much more ahead on our streaming network right now, NBC News Now, and of course tomorrow morning, bright and early on Today.
And coming up tonight on NBC Nightly News, for all of us here at NBC News, thank you for watching. I'm Lester Holt.